Nobody in Harmon Falls could quite agree on when Marabella Masterson had stopped being a gentle soul. Some said it was the winter her mother passed. Others pointed to the summer George Masterson's health began to slip, when the ranch started leaning on her the way an old fence leans on its last good post. But most folks, if they were being honest, figured it had less to do with grief and more to do with the fact that Marabella had simply grown tired of people deciding things for her. And George Masterson had a long history of deciding things. She found out about the engagement on a Tuesday, not from her father directly, from Inez. Inez ran the dry goods store on the main stretch of Harmon Falls and had known Marabella since she was small enough to hide behind flour sacks. And she was the kind of woman who delivered difficult news the way a doctor sets a broken bone, quickly, with both hands, and without apology. "Your father wrote to the Brigham family 6 months ago," Inez said, not looking up from her ledger. "The son is coming. Should be here before the end of the month." Marabella had stood very still for a long moment. Then she set her basket on the counter and walked out without her order. She didn't speak to her father that evening. She sat across the supper table and watched him eat, and George Masterson, to his credit, never once looked up. He knew his daughter well enough to understand that her silence was not acceptance. It was the kind of quiet that needed time before it became words. When the words finally came, 2 days later, they were measured and firm. "I won't do it," she told him. But George set down his coffee. He looked older than he had even a month ago. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and his hands, once steady enough to rope a calf at full run, rested against the table with a kind of careful deliberateness that made her chest tighten. "The ranch needs," he began. "The ranch needs rain and a new well casing," she said. "It doesn't need a stranger walking in and putting his name on everything we built." George was quiet for a long time. "His family is good people, Bella. His father and I made an agreement when you were both still young. I should have told you sooner. That's on me." He paused. "But the agreement stands." Marabella said nothing more that night, but she made a private decision, there at that table, that whatever man arrived from wherever the Brighams came from, that she would not make it easy for him. She would not smile at him across the supper table. She would not pretend. And she would certainly not marry him simply because 2 old men had shaken hands over it years ago. Hezekiah Brigham rode into Harmon Falls on a gray morning when the sky couldn't decide between clouds and clearing. He came alone, which surprised the few people watching from the porch of the feed store. A man arriving to meet his intended usually brought someone, a brother, a hired hand, at least the appearance of consequence. Hezekiah brought only a brown horse, a bedroll, and a canvas bag that had seen better years. He was not what Harmon Falls expected. He wasn't rough-looking exactly, but he wasn't polished either. His coat was good quality but worn at the elbows. His boots were clean, and his face was calm in the way that either meant a man had nothing to worry about or had long since made peace with his worries, and it was difficult, at first glance, to tell which. He stopped at Inez's store first. She recognized the name when he gave it, and she studied him for a moment longer than was strictly polite before pointing him toward the Masterson ranch. She did not tell him what was waiting for him there. It wasn't her place. But she did say, carefully, "The young woman has a strong character," and left him to interpret that however he chose. Hezekiah simply nodded. "I'd expect nothing less," he said, and walked back out into the gray morning. Marabella was mending fence line on the eastern edge of the property when she first saw him. She didn't know who he was. That was important. But she saw only a stranger on horseback moving along the road that bordered their land, slow and unhurried, looking at the hills the way a man looks when he is trying to decide if a place suits him. It irritated her immediately. She couldn't have explained why exactly. There was something about the ease of him, the way he sat his horse like he had nowhere pressing to be, like the land was already answering some question he had quietly asked it. She went back to her fence post. He stopped. "You've got a wire pulling loose about 40 yards back," he called over. "Left it much longer and the whole section comes down." Marabella straightened and looked at him. "I know," she said. "Just thought you might not have seen it." "I saw it." A pause. He didn't leave, but he didn't push either. He simply sat there with that same unhurried calm, and it bothered her more than if he had argued back. "You passing through?" she asked, because something about his stillness made her want to fill the silence. "No," he said. "I don't think so." She waited for him to say more. He didn't. "This is private land," she said. "I'm on the road," he replied, without any edge in his voice, simply stating a fact. Marabella turned back to her work. She heard him ride on eventually, slow and easy, and she told herself she didn't care where he was going. Harmon Falls had its share of drifters who mistook the quietness of a place for an invitation. She forgot about him by evening, or she believed she had. He was at the supper table when she came inside. George Masterson stood at the head of the table with more color in his face than he'd had in weeks, and the stranger from the road sat across from him with his hat in his lap and his hands folded with that same unnerving patience. Her father looked up when she came through the door. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite guilt, but close. "Bella," he said carefully. "This is Hezekiah Brigham." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Marabella stood in the doorway for a moment that stretched well past comfortable. The man from the road, the one she had spoken to with barely concealed irritation, the one she had dismissed as a drifter, looked up at her with an expression she could not fully read. He had known exactly who she was. Every word she had spoken at that fence line came back to her in a single, clarifying rush. And from the slight steadiness in his eyes, not amusement, not superiority, and just a quiet kind of knowing, she understood that he had let her say every one of them. She said nothing. She pulled out her chair, sat down, and reached for the bread, but her hand was not entirely steady. Marabella did not sleep well that night. She lay in the dark, listening to the ranch settle around her, the creak of timber, the distant sound of horses shifting in the barn. And she turned the evening over in her mind, the way you turn a stone you've tripped on, looking for what you missed. He had known. From the moment she'd spoken to him at the fence line, from the first word she'd said, he had known exactly who she was. And he had said nothing. Had sat there on that horse with his quiet eyes and his unhurried manner, and let her be rude to him without offering a single correction. She didn't know what bothered her more, or that he had known, or that she couldn't decide what it meant that he hadn't told her. By morning she had settled on anger, because anger was at least familiar. Hezekiah was already up when she came downstairs. He had found the coffee without being shown where it was kept, and he was standing at the kitchen window with a cup in his hand, looking out at the barn the way he had looked at the hills the day before, like he was reading something written in the grain of the wood, and the lean of the structure, and the way the light fell across the yard. He heard her come in, but didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his expression was straightforward and unguarded, which somehow made it harder to hold on to her composure. "Morning," he said. "You went through my father's kitchen," she replied. "He told me to make myself at home." A pause. "I can put the coffee back if that helps." It was not said with sarcasm. That was the difficulty. It was said plainly, like a man genuinely offering to undo what he had done if it caused offense, and Marabella found she had no clean response to that. She crossed to the stove and poured her own cup without answering him. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It sat somewhere in the middle, like weather that hadn't decided what it wanted to be. "You let me talk to you like you were nobody," she said finally, her back still to him. "You didn't know who I was." "You did." "Yes," he said simply. She turned around. "Why didn't you say something?" Hezekiah looked at her for a moment before answering, and she had the distinct impression he was choosing his words not out of calculation, but out of genuine care for their accuracy. "Because I wanted to see who you were before you knew who I was," he said. "People behave differently when they think they're being evaluated." Marabella held his gaze. "And what did you conclude?" "That you work hard," he said, "that you know your land, and that you'd rather do a thing yourself than wait for someone else to offer." It was not a compliment delivered to charm her. It was an observation delivered because he believed it was true, and that distinction settled over her in a way she didn't entirely know what to do with. She looked down at her coffee. "Don't think that changes anything," she said. "I don't," he replied. George Masterson came to breakfast looking better than he had in months, and Marabella noticed it with a complicated feeling she couldn't quite name. Relief and resentment braided together. Relief that her father had color in his face. Resentment that the cause of it appeared to be the arrival of the man she was determined not to accept. Over eggs and cold biscuits, her father and Hezekiah talked about the ranch with an ease that should have taken weeks to build. Hezekiah asked questions that were specific and practical, about the well, about the grazing rotation, about which sections of fence were holding and which were not. He did not offer opinions unless George asked for them. He listened more than he spoke. Marabella watched from the edges of the conversation and said very little. After breakfast, George asked Hezekiah to ride the northern pasture and give his thoughts on the drainage problem that had plagued that section for 2 seasons. Hezekiah agreed without ceremony and went to saddle his horse. When he was gone, George looked at his daughter across the cleared table. "You could be worse off, Bella," he said quietly. "You could have asked me," she replied. "Before any of this, you could have simply asked." George was quiet for a long moment. The honesty of it settled between them without drama, and he did not try to argue his way around it. "You're right," he said. "I should have." It was perhaps the last answer she had expected, and it took the sharp edge off her anger without removing it entirely. She found herself riding the northern pasture that afternoon, for reasons she did not examine too closely. Hezekiah was on foot when she arrived, crouching near the low point of the drainage line, with his coat off and his sleeves rolled, pressing his hand into the earth to feel where the water was sitting. He looked up when he heard her horse but didn't stand immediately, finishing what he was doing before he rose. "The grade's wrong," he said by way of greeting. "Whoever dug this originally pulled the slope the wrong direction. Water's been backing up at the root line of those cottonwoods for probably 3 years. Marabella dismounted. She walked over and looked where he was pointing, and she saw immediately that he was right. It was the kind of thing you could miss if you'd looked at a piece of land long enough to stop truly seeing it. That realization annoyed her more than his presence did. My father's been trying to figure that out since the spring before last," she said. "Easy to miss on your own land," he said, without any suggestion that missing it had been a failure. "You're too close to it." She looked at him sideways. "Do you do that deliberately?" "Do what?" "Say things that are difficult to argue with." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the beginning of one that he appeared to think better of. "I say what I think is true," he said. "I don't always get it right." They stood together over the drainage line for a while, and Marabella found herself talking through the ranch's problems with a frankness she hadn't intended. The east well, the section of roof on the hay barn that had been patched twice without holding, but the grazing rotation her father had set up years ago that no longer made sense for the size of the herd. Hezekiah listened. He asked a question here and there. He did not take over the conversation or redirect it toward himself. By the time she realized how long they had been standing there, the light had moved well across the sky, and the air had cooled. She picked up her horse's reins and prepared to leave without making anything of it. "Marabella," he said. She stopped, but didn't turn fully. "I know this wasn't your choice," he said. "I want you to know I understand that." The words were quiet and without performance. She stood with her back half to him and felt them settle somewhere she hadn't left open for them to land. She didn't answer. She rode back toward the house with the late afternoon light cutting long and gold across the grass, and she did not let herself think about the look on his face when he had said it. But she thought about it anyway. That evening, Inez came for supper, as she sometimes did on Wednesdays. She took one measured look at the seating arrangement. Hezekiah across from Marabella, George at the head, and said nothing beyond pleasantries through most of the meal. But when George and Hezekiah stepped outside afterward to look at something on the porch, Inez folded her napkin and looked at Marabella with the particular expression she reserved for moments when she intended to say something the other person wasn't ready to hear. "He's not what you built up in your mind," Inez said. "I haven't built anything," Marabella replied. Inez picked up her coffee cup. "No," she said mildly. "I can see that." Marabella looked out the window toward the porch, where the low sound of her father's voice carried through the glass. Hezekiah was listening, nodding once. Her father laughed at something, a real laugh, not the careful kind he'd been producing for months. She looked away before she could read anything into it, but the sound of her father's laugh stayed with her long after the dishes were cleared and the lamp was turned low and the house had gone quiet around her. And somewhere in the dark, without quite meaning to, she began to wonder what kind of man sits through being dismissed and insulted and given every reason to leave, and stays anyway. The trouble started on a Friday, the way most trouble in small towns does, quietly and in public. Well, Marabella had gone into Harmon Falls for supplies, and Hezekiah had come along at her father's quiet suggestion, which she had not protested as firmly as she might have a week ago. She told herself it was because arguing had grown tiresome. She did not examine that reasoning too closely. They moved through the main street separately, each with their own list, meeting occasionally at the wagon to set down what they had gathered. It was an arrangement that suited Marabella. Functional, impersonal, the kind of thing two people could do without it meaning anything. It was outside the hardware store that she overheard them. Two men she recognized, ranchers from the valley's eastern edge, older, of the kind who had always spoken to her father with a particular brand of courtesy that never quite extended to her, were talking in the unhurried way of men who believed no one of consequence was listening. "George Masterson's brought in some outsider to run that place," one of them said, "dressing it up as a match for the girl, but everyone knows the ranch is near finished. He's selling, the name is what he's doing." The other one made a sound of agreement. "She won't last 6 months once the old man goes. Ranch'll fold, and the Brigham boy'll cut his losses and move on. You'll see." Marabella stood very still beside the hardware store wall. She had heard talk before. Harmon Falls was not a town that kept its opinions to itself. But something about hearing it stated so flatly, so certainly, with her father's name and her family's land reduced to a transaction that had already failed in these men's estimation, made something go tight and cold in her chest. She was still standing there when Hezekiah came around the corner. He read her face before she said a word. His eyes moved briefly to the two men, who had not yet noticed either of them, and then back to her. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply fell into step beside her and walked her back to the wagon, his presence steady and unhurried, as it always was. When they reached it, he took the supply list from her hand without comment and went back for the remaining items himself. Marabella sat on the wagon bench and looked at the street and breathed slowly. When he came back and climbed up beside her and took the reins, she said, without looking at him, "How much of that is true?" It was not quite a question. Hezekiah was quiet for a moment. He guided the horse onto the road heading out of town before he answered. "Your father's finances are difficult," he said. "That part is true. The ranch needs work and capital and time." He paused. "The rest of it isn't." "How can you be certain of that last part?" she said. "You've known us 3 weeks. "I know what I came here for," he said. "And it wasn't land." The road stretched out ahead of them, pale and dry under the afternoon sun. Marabella kept her eyes forward. "Then what was it?" she asked, and her voice was quieter than she had intended. Hezekiah took a moment before he answered. And she had learned enough about him by now to know that his pauses were not evasions. They were the shape of a man who refused to say something until he was certain he meant it. "My father spoke well of George Masterson for as long as I can remember," he said. "Said he was the most honest man he'd ever done business with. When he wrote about his daughter, he said she ran that ranch with more sense than most men he knew." He kept his eyes on the road. "I came because I thought a life built alongside someone like that was worth the distance it took to get here." Marabella said nothing for a long time. The wagon rolled on. The hills on either side of the road were gold and brown with late-season grass, and the sky above them was the particular deep blue that only came in the hour before it began to soften toward evening. "Well, you should have told me who you were," she said finally. "At the fence line." "Yes," he agreed. "I should have." She looked at him then, directly, and without the guard she had kept carefully in place for 3 weeks. "Why didn't you?" He met her eyes briefly before returning his attention to the road. "Because you looked at me like I was just a man," he said, "and I wanted to stay that for a little while, before I became an arrangement." Something in Marabella's chest shifted, not dramatically, not with any of the sudden clarity that people describe in stories. It was slower than that. The way ice at the edge of a river gives way in early spring, so gradually you almost don't notice until the water is moving again. She looked back at the road. "You're still in arrangement," she said. "I know," he replied. And there was something in the way he said it, patient and unhurried, like a man who had decided to tend to something carefully and was prepared to do so for as long as it required, that said more than argument ever could have. George Masterson called them both to the front room that evening. He sat in his chair by the window, with a plainness about him that told Marabella this was not a casual conversation. He had the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally decided to set it down regardless of where it landed. "I owe you both an honest accounting," he said. He told them everything. The extent of the debt against the ranch, the 2 seasons of poor yield, the medical costs he had kept from Marabella by quietly borrowing against the land. But he spoke without self-pity and without asking for absolution, and when he was finished, he folded his hands in his lap and waited. Marabella sat with it all settling over her. Piece by piece, the picture assembled itself into something she should have seen sooner, and she recognized with a dull ache that her father had hidden it from her. He's not out of deception, but out of the particular stubbornness of a man who had spent his whole life solving his own problems and could not bring himself to stop even when the problems had grown beyond him. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said softly. Because you would have carried it, he said, and you were already carrying enough. The room was quiet. Hezekiah spoke then, and he addressed himself to George directly. The well can be redug before winter. But the drainage in the north pasture is fixable in a week with the right labor. The debt, he paused carefully, is manageable if the next 2 seasons are worked right. He looked at the older man steadily. None of this is finished unless you decide it is. George Masterson looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at his daughter. Marabella was already looking at Hezekiah. She was thinking about a man who had ridden into a failing ranch and a hostile woman and an uncomfortable arrangement, and had not once, in 3 weeks, looked for the door. Who had fixed things quietly without being asked, who had listened to her father laugh again, who had sat beside her on a wagon bench and told her the truth without decoration or apology. She thought about the fence line, about the words she had said not knowing who he was, and about the fact that he had heard every one of them and stayed anyway. She found him at the barn after her father had gone to bed. He was checking the latch on the main door, which had been sticking for days, something she had mentioned once in passing, not to him specifically, but simply aloud. He had remembered it anyway. She stood a few feet away and waited until he turned. I owe you an apology, she said, for the fence line, for the first week, for most of the second week, if I'm being thorough. The corner of his mouth moved. This time he let it become a smile, small and genuine, and without any trace of triumph in it. You don't owe me anything, he said. I'm giving it anyway, she replied, so you might as well take it. He looked at her in the thin lamplight that fell through the barn door, and something in his expression was open in a way she hadn't seen before. Unguarded, like a man who has been careful for a long time, finally allowing himself not to be. I'd like to try this properly, she said, if you're willing, not as an arrangement, as a... She paused, searching for the right word and finding it without ceremony. As a beginning. Hezekiah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've been willing since the fence line. Marabella looked at him steadily. Even when I was terrible to you? Especially then, he said simply. You were honest. I'd rather have honest than comfortable. She laughed then, a real one, quiet and unplanned, the kind that comes before you think to stop it. And Hezekiah Brigham, for the first time since he had ridden into Harmon Falls on a gray, uncertain morning, looked entirely at ease. Yet they were married in the late spring, when the north pasture drainage had been fixed, and the new well was drawing clean, and the ranch had begun to look like something with a future again. Inez stood in the front row and did not say a single word of the variety of I told you so, which was perhaps the greatest act of restraint Harmon Falls had ever witnessed. George Masterson walked his daughter to the front of the small gathering with his back straight and his eyes bright, and when he placed her hand in Hezekiah's, he held on for just a moment longer than was necessary, the way a man holds on to something he has been afraid of losing and is only now allowing himself to believe is safe. Marabella looked at her husband during the words that bound them and thought about everything she had said at that fence line, yet about how certain she had been, about how completely and quietly he had dismantled every wall she had built, not by force, but by simply refusing to leave. Hezekiah looked back at her the way he had always looked at things he found worth his attention, steadily, unhurriedly, like a man with nowhere else he would rather be. When it was done, Inez embraced Marabella and said into her ear very quietly, I knew before you did. I know you did, Marabella replied. I was very gracious about it. You were insufferable about it. Inez pulled back with a perfectly composed expression. Same thing in the end. In the years that followed, the Brigham Ranch, for that was what it became, Masterson and Brigham, in equal measure on the deed, grew into one of the most steadily run operations in the valley. Not the largest, not the most talked about, but the kind of place that looked like it would still be standing long after the flashier spreads had come and gone. George lived to see his first grandchild, a girl with her mother's directness and her father's patience, which everyone agreed was a combination that would either be remarkable or exhausting, and was most likely going to be both. Hezekiah never did fully explain why he had stayed silent at the fence line for as long as he had, beyond what he had already said. But sometimes, in the evenings, when they sat together on the porch watching the light leave the hills, Marabella would look at him sideways and say, "You should have told me sooner." And he would say, "Probably." And she would say nothing else, because the truth was that she had long since stopped believing it, that she had needed every single one of those difficult days to find her way to this one. And some things, she had come to understand, cannot be rushed, only tended to, quietly and without giving up, until they become what they were always meant to be.